Hi all, and welcome to episode 3 of Forewarned, Forearmed. Taking on T55 spam, no less. So here's some of my tips and experience for taking on the Horde, as we call it. We do have a couple of people in our area who love playing either Syrians or Iraqis or Soviets who do have quite a big spammy units in regards to that. So I'm going to give you how I feel, what I would do, and how I go about taking on these lists. However, first up, let's set the narrative. So, you started playing Team Yankee at the start of the year, you're getting into it, you're having a few games at your local every fortnight, you started painting your list up, you're feeling good, having some few games, a few losses at the same time, but you're learning the game, which is great. So your local goes, hey, we're putting up a tournament at the end of the month. So you go, great. It's a good way to, see other people within the community, play games against people you probably don't know who are in the community, who probably don't play on the day that you go in to play. So you get your list painted up, ready to go. You take a stock standard list of US because that's what you've been looking at for your faction. And that's what you want to play in this game, is US, because they seem to have all the toys. So you go forward in this tournament. It's a 4-round tournament, and it has your best painted, best sport, and your first, second, and third. And you have about 10 people for the tournament. So you manage to win your first game 6-3. And this gives you a bit of a high for the tournament day because, this is your first tournament playing Team Yankee and you're sitting there going, hey, maybe I have a chance of getting into the top 3 if I keep going because, that splits the pack in half, so to speak. 5 people win. So that gives you a relatively good chance of trying to get in the top 3 for the day. So, on to the next round. The TO calls out your name and your opponent's name. He gives you a table number, and you walk over to that table, and you start having some, concerns when you look at the miniatures list, or the amount of minis that your opponent has, because it's like, that's quite a bit. You're probably wondering, hey, is that an actual legal list? And then you go, hey, can I have your list? I just want to see what's in there. And then he hands over you his list of the day, and that's when your heart sinks and it dawns on you that his list is T55 spam. And not only that, there's a lot of it. So let's have a look at that list first off and get over the shock of how much you actually have to deal with. So this is what we're dealing with in our example today. So we're dealing with 3 T55 Panzer battalions, each with 3 T55s of 5 tank units. So your MSU side of the house, because why not? Because that's how a lot of these armies do work for spam, is MSU, multiple sword units, for those who don't know the acronym. And each one has the HQ as well, so that's 16 points in total, so that gives us, 48 points. That's half the force in tanks, and it gives us a lot of tanks to deal with. So we're dealing with nearly 50 tanks, or closer to 48, but nearly 50. That's a lot of T55s to deal with. On top of that, he's also got 2 mid-strength BTR companies, both with spigots, 2 of them, so that's a lot to deal with there. He also has a couple of Gaskin in it as well. And then in his support choices, he's got some Acacias, a BMPOP, some Spandrel, another couple of units of Gaskin, and some Hinds. So, and on top of that, he's also got a couple of Reese units with BRDMs. So that's a lot to get rid of. That's 22 units in total. And that's a lot on the board. Compared to our list. Let's have a look at our list. Ours is a US list. So, as I said, we spent some time painting this list up, getting it ready to go. You know, we thought about it and we just wanted the 1 unit in reserve. So, our list is a mech infantry platoon for US because, hey, that's what we like to play. And currently, this is all we've bought and all we've wanted to play because, you know, it's very similar to what we've seen and it has all the toys we like and it's kind of the theme list that I was going for. Because, hey, you know, this is what I've seen or been with while I've served. So why not? So let's have a look. It's mech infantry platoons times 3, each all with a dragon upgrade. And then we've got our single reserve unit, which is 3 M1A1s. On top of that, we've got some mortars and 2 anti-tank platoons. And then on top of that, we've got a LAVs company because, hey, you know, it's cheaper to get some LAVs, an extra bit of firepower because, you know, RF3 with the LAVs for shooting. Plus they have spearhead. Plus it also gives us access to the LAV tows, which is great. So we've taken some unit of tows plus those other AT platoons as well within our mech infantry list. And then support, we got some VADs and stingers because, you know, just to mitigate some air, but also because VADs are really good at dual purpose role. So that's our list for the day, and it's not much. It's probably half the size, if not a third, of what that East German list is. And it's like, how am I supposed to deal with all of that? That is a lot to deal with. And this is where we start thinking about the first thing. And that's IPB, Intelligence Preparation of the Battle Space. And the reason for that is we've now got to start looking at how we can get that down. How we can start looking at the terrain on the field of play for our table to sort of go and figure out how we're going to deploy and deal with this. So the first thing we've got to think about is the mission. So I know a lot of people start thinking when they go and play spam, it's like, hey, maybe I need minefields, I'll play defend. Look, I've only got the 1 unit. I probably may be able to hold out until that 1 unit arrives because it's not, you know, it's not like I'm losing a whole bunch of little units. I'm only got the 1 unit reserved, so I've got the majority of my force on field, so I'm not too overly worried about, you know, having to defend with half my force under like what you'd have for the V1 rules. So you start thinking about defend and maybe it's preferable with the table we're playing on. So first of all, let's have a look at our table. So here's our table. So we can see how we've got some roads, quite a few forest areas, some hills, a little bit of a city block over there on the right. And now we need to start thinking about mission and how we're going to choose our stance. So we're thinking maybe if we defend, we could probably put some minefields in there. You know, we kind of understand the defend missions because, you know, they do mitigate some aspects of certain things, but we're thinking in our mind, defend. No. You know, defend or maneuver against the spam list is basically giving your opponent what they want. What a T55 spam list doesn't want is having to put a majority of their units in reserve, or at least some of their units in reserve, because they've spent a lot to get all these units on the board, and they're really, really hoping for people to either choose maneuver or defend, because they're going to play the attack stance. They're always going to play the attack stance. They're never going to play any other stance but attack. So you already sort of like know that, and I guess the other thing is you're trying to get over the psychological hit of having to face so much tanks. So then we need to consider the missions. So if we take attack stance, we know 3 of those missions are going to be 60-60 forces on the field, and they are dust up, encounter, and probe. So 2, 3, and 5. So law of averages is like we're at least going to get one of those missions. So say we roll, let's get a dice, we roll it up, and it comes up a 3, so encounter. So now we've got the encounter mission up. So we look at the rules and we go, thankfully, it's 60-60. One of us is going to have immediate reserves, the other's going to have scattered delayed. Both have scattered delayed reserves. So now we need to start considering deployment and the rest of it. Now remember, the first thing of IPB is that terrain analysis. We start looking at the terrain, try to figure out where we want to deploy, and that comes hand in hand. So if we look at our field, our table here, we probably want to see if we roll off and say we do either get either attacker or defender. We need to figure out where we want to play. You know, what's going to be best for us to defend from. So if we look at this, we've got some pretty good avenues to defend from both sides of the field. You know, the worst side to probably defend from is our bottom here, just for the pure fact there's not much areas to put our infantry in, just in cover to get them, you know, that make them a lot more difficult to hit. So let's go worst case scenario, we're defending from the bottom. So in a counter, he's placed our two objectives. Two objectives are down, one here on the side of the road to the left and another one to the right. So he deploys first. He's going to try and spearhead his units as close to the board as possible. So he's trying to get up to the board as possible to you, to basically rush you within first turn. So that's their deployment mindset. So, you know, when you start taking turns, you've got to remember, you know, T55s with a lot of units are going to try and spearhead just to get them further up the board. Especially in this case as the attacker, because that just gives them a numerical advantage. But don't forget, he's also got, you know, 40% or 40 points in this general in reserve. So he's had to put at least a single T55 company in reserve, probably his Hinds as well, because let's face it, you know, meeting engagement. So it's a good chance they're not going to be there first turn, especially if you're the attacker. And then he'll probably put in a BTR company in reserve as well. So that's 40 points bang straight up. But that still leaves us with like 32 tanks to deal with, which is a lot, plus the BTRs, plus all the leftover units that we have to deal with. So that's still quite a bit. So if we go back to looking at our terrain analysis, we've got to start realizing what we can do. So first things first is we've got to look at his list and go, okay, that's a lot to deal with, but we're not dealing with 50 tanks now, we're only dealing with 30. So at least we've got rid of nearly 20 tanks. So that's a lot less to deal with than what we were dealing with before. Plus we don't have to deal with that extra platoon of infantry, and we don't have to deal with the Hinds straight up. So that's great. So after we place the objectives, we start deploying. We know he's deploying spearhead forward to give him that advantage to get his tanks forward. We do the same. We deploy our spearhead forward, but we want to try and deploy our spearhead into cover, most likely into those trees on either side of that road, just so we can get our infantry in front of those objectives, because we want to screen those objectives with our infantry. So we can use that screen basically so we can get in there quickly enough to give them a head. Now, to be fair, I would actually probably most likely screen them with your 113s. Because at this stage, your 113s are not really that much going to help you out. You know, they're only really good against the infantry and probably chasing down a few light tanks because of the 50 cals. It's only 84 firepower, 4 plus. Or 5 plus for the 50 cals. But, yeah. So we want to probably screen those objectives with that and just have our infantry just on those objectives in front of the objective, but not too far in front. So just on that line. So if we do get pushed back, we're still within 4 inches of that objective and contesting. But it also allows us to use our dragons and our 66ers, hopefully within our first turn as well, to actually try to eliminate as many T55s as possible. On top of that, you've also got your labs and your TO2s. You want to deploy them back as much as possible, probably in those hills on either side of the map. I do apologise for the other side of the map, it's just another forest. But basically on those hills, or most likely on this hill to the left of the map, you want to deploy all your toes in there, because it gives you a good line of coverage, but you've also got them, if you want to get them hold down, that gives them 6s to hit on the way back. So especially with the hammerhead rule, so it gives you a good chance to hold one objective quite well. So that means we need to place our second infantry unit off to that right side to give more coverage for our unit there. And it also allows us to get some more AT side of the house and board as well with our Dragons and 66s. So that's how we're going to deploy. And that's after we've done our terrain analysis as part of our IPB and tried to mitigate as much as T55 spam as possible. So that's something to consider as like the first part of trying to deal with this is picking the right stance. And that's probably the biggest one to go forward, is picking that right stance. Because if you don't pick the right stance, it can go quite pear-shaped. You know, as I said, it's like your opponent always wants to have the numerical superiority against you. So he always wants to have the numbers. That's always the biggest take from this, is that spam lists or horde lists always want to have the number advantage. So the sooner you can take that number advantage away from them, it hurts them as much as possible. So that's a big one, is trying to get rid of that numerical superior numbers advantage that the T55 spam has. Now, a good T55 opponent will try to rush the board as quickly as possible. They might also have something different in their list. Now, the list I've given is just an example of a mega T55 horde. So other things to consider apart from that deployment state is the first turn. You know the first turn they're going to rush the board as quickly as possible. If they're going to try and get shots, they'll try to rush it with probably maybe, you know, the majority of those T55s and then have some of them supporting. Now, another thing to consider with spam is the parking lot mentality. Now, this may sound a bit, I guess, over the top in regards to tournament play, and it might bring some ear to some people, but enforce the line of sight rules. Enforce them. Like, this is the thing with spam lists. They can't shoot through their own teams. So when it comes to the shooting phase, I know it's going to be a bit really, you know, anal, I guess, or really retentive to enforce it, but enforce it, because at the end of the day, it's still within the rules. It's a bit of a jerk move, but against the spam, you need to say, hey, look, you're shooting through your own units, please check your line of sight, because that also will basically limit the return of shots to your army. And yes, I know your opponent might go, that's a shit move, but at the end of the day, you know, you've got to consider that is within the rules. And this is a tournament, you're trying to win. Like, you're not trying to win 8-1 or 7-2, because, you know, you've just got to accept the losses with it. You will lose quite a few units against T55 spam, just for the field pack, they have the numbers. So the best you can always hope for is a 6-3 against them. But enforcing those line of sight rules is a big one, because if they start bunching up, especially because of the terrain on the field, they're not going to be able to shoot your units. So you've got to make sure to enforce them. If you have any issues, always call over your TO. I'm pretty sure your TO will be more than happy to say, hey, look, that's correct. I know it's probably pedantic that this person is calling you out on that, but it's something that we, I think, sometimes forget about in Flames of War and Team Yankee, is the line of sight rules, that you can't shoot through your own teams, and ensuring that, you know, line of sight rule. So moving forward, that's two areas, you know, we need to consider about trying to take on the 2-5 fort. Yeah, I know one of them's a bit of a, I guess, contention with a lot of people out there, but to be honest, it's a tournament at the end of the day. If this was like any other day or a friendly local, you probably wouldn't care about it. You'd probably just accept, I'm playing T55 for spam at my local. Yeah, I'm going to lose, but at least I might have some fun doing it, or I'll learn something. So going forward, that's another tip, is to enforce those rules, because, you know, it will try to at least mitigate some of those shots back at you. So we know he's going to rush up the board. Now, we're probably going to take some hits, but with our list, we've got to try and take off the first units. So we're going to try and focus fire as much as we can to mitigate most of those units coming in, so when they do assault, we have a better chance of repelling them. So, we try to at least take out one unit at a time, going from left to right or right to left, whichever way you want to go, trying to get rid of as many units as possible that are closest to us. So then, we're going to get shot back, but once our M1A1s arrive, then we could start having more fun. So we got to try and do that and hold out for at least 2 to 3 turns, and then wait for the M1A1s to arrive. Now, once the M1A1s have arrived due to scatter, because that's the mission we're playing with Encounter, depending on which side of the board they come on, you're more likely to probably have them in the middle, which is great, because at least that way you can try to push them out wherever you can. They do have that massive threat range of 14 inches, but because your opponent's placed those 2 objectives close towards the middle of the table, even if you end up on both flanks, you still got the movement to try and get over there to at least stop or halt those T55s as close as possible before they jump on your objective. So they're one of the things to consider. Now, that's how a US list would probably take it on. I hear a lot of people out there say, well, what about West Germans or any other NATO force, which is really big heavy? So if we have a look at our West German force, which I've done up as well, and this is the one thing I've got to stress, more than anything, it's combined arms within Team Yankee. It's the only way to go. I see a lot of people going, I just want to take a pure tank force because it's what I like. That's great for day-to-day, everyday play, but when you're thinking about competitive play, you've got to go on with that mindset of, I need a list that will take everybody on, I can choose all my stances, but I've got all the firepower I want. So in this list, we've got 3 mech Panzergrenadierzugs, all with Milans. We've got 4 Leopard 2s, some Jags, some Jag 2s, a little bit of everything. But it's combined arms. Like, it's still, at the end of the day, a combined arms list that I would play in a tournament at 100 points. And it's very similar to the Dutch list I'd use to win the Australian Nationals. So this is another thing to consider. It doesn't matter about how many tanks you're going to face your opponent. It's the list building itself and trying to mitigate as much as possible with combined arms that does help you win games. Because taking on the T55 spam is, you're trying to take on them. Now, if you start choosing lots of tanks, say if you choose like a Leopard 2 company, it makes it a lot harder. I will agree, that's a hard slog, because you're going to get outmaneuvered and outplayed quite well. Just for the pure fact that they got the numbers, they will try to reach around and get to your side flanks very quickly and destroy your tanks, and then it's all game over. Now, that's something that, most people consider, I guess, the issue with T55 spam is, when you play an all-tank force. But for me personally, I don't play all-tank forces unless it's part of the tournament restrictions. But at the end of the day, it's like, taking on T55 spam, you need to consider trying to mitigate as much of them as possible and trying to get them down really low. I think some of the comments you'll probably see on Facebook most often is like, they're going to rush you, they're going to outnumber you, they're going to get through. There's no way you can beat them with tanks. You can still beat them with tanks in theory and in practice. It just takes some very good patience. You've got to really look at the board and your placement of units and try to figure out what you want to do. Now, things with Leopard 2s, I love them because they do have the skill and they do have the speed. So you've got to use that skill and speed to get them where they need. Like, there are 3 up for the skill. That gives them an extra 4 inches with Blitz. Blitz all the time with them if you can. It gives you 18 inches with their 14-inch move, with their attack move. They do have rate of fire too. They do have a AT-22 gun. So if it hits a T-55, good chance is that 55 is a burning cinder block. So in that respect, with West Germans, like, this list will do quite well. It's very similar to our US list that we've got, in the fact that it's got heaps of Milans, heaps and heaps of AT, plus our Leopards in reserve. That shouldn't have an issue holding off against any type of T-55 list. And there's plenty in there to take it all on. So again, it comes down to how you build your list to take on T-55 spam. If you build your list to take on anything, it shouldn't have an issue. And this is why combined arms is the way to go. And I guess it comes down to another list that has quite a bit of a swarmy, spammy feel, is this Syrian T55/BTR mech battalion list. Again, it's the same principle that applies. Trying to mitigate that whole mission factor and psychological factor. It's like, yeah, there's a lot to deal with, there's a lot there, but, you know, there's quite a bit of infantry. But at the end of the day, they still got to throw 40 points of that in reserve. So they've got to choose to throw, like, the majority of that force into reserve. And this comes down to the same feeling. You've got to pick the right stance. Because not picking the right stance, it does get you into a lot of trouble. So that's my thoughts on the Syrian list and the West German list. So there's two comparable lists, you know, that going forward that use both examples. So I'd say when we really look at it, it's like picking the stance is probably the biggest factor, and trying to mitigate that by 50-50. Like, as I said, it's like there's quite a bit there, but when you look at it, it's like he'd have to either reserve all his infantry or the majority of his tanks and infantry. So it's like, either way, you're not dealing with, you know, 41 T55s and a ton of infantry and BTRs. You're dealing with half of that, at least. So that's another thing to take your mind off, you know. It's either all the infantry is in reserve or half and half. So either way, that's a lot to deal with. But at the end of the day, you've got a mindset of that's it, you know, trying to mitigate that as much as possible. Like, if you can only take on, say, 22 T55s and, you know, 24 BTRs and a couple of large BTR units, then job done. Job done at the end of the day, because you've mitigated the risk factors and got them down low enough to at least give you a fighting chance. The other thing to take away from T55s is don't forget about their cross-check. Their cross-check is rather poor, so 4+. So they're going to try to avoid terrain as much as possible. And I think that goes hand in hand with, if you were going to try and play defend, you'd probably try and put it in the open to force them through terrain. But at the same time, that also hampers your difficulties trying to shoot at them as well. So, yeah. So that goes back to our other tips as well. So we're getting a bit off track, I think, and we need to get back on how to tackle T55 spam. So the first two things we have considered is the mission. Always choose attack with your mission, and always enforce line of sight rules. They're the two biggest ones, because that will help a lot going forward competitively. 3 for me is actually the psychological factor. You know, making mistakes is being human. But fear in itself causing you to make mistakes, that can be mitigated. So trying to think about how to take on a horde like that and getting overwhelmed by saying, there's no way I can possibly do this, there's too many of them, that's another mistake. You've got to go forward with the mindset. It's like, I've got my plan, I've got what I've got to do, I'm just going to treat this like any other day, and I'm just going to try and get rid as much as possible and try to do what I can do. So that's tip 3, is the psychological fact. Just forget about trying to take them on and getting overwhelmed by so much spam. Because if you get overwhelmed by so much spam, you start making mistakes because you start second guess, especially when that first turn hits you and they rush you. So don't forget, they got a massive dash speed. They'll dash as quickly as they can, especially in open terrain, and try to at least close within 8 inches of the objective on the first turn, or at least get as close to possible to assault you next turn. That'll push you there, and especially in missions where those objectives are live from the get-go. And this is why most people probably go defend, because at the end of the day, it's like, oh, you've got to hold them out for 6 turns. Which is great if you want to hold them out for 6 turns. But I think at the same time, it's like, yeah, that's all well and true, but it doesn't help if you start losing control of the flow. And that's another one, is losing control of the flow of the battle. So try to keep up that pressure on that T55 spam by pushing him back and getting him frustrated to the point where he starts losing more tanks than what he has to push you off objectives, that's when they start going, okay, got to start playing conservatively with my tanks. I've got to start choosing where to go. I've got to start picking more targets to shoot at. And by then it's too late. And that's when your cav comes on and you start making your counter attack and start pushing them back. And that's where you start trying to mitigate them. So there are 4 tips. So far our tips are mission, picking the right stance, enforcing line of sight rules, a psychological factor, and counterattack. Making sure you have a good plan for your counterattack and trying to mitigate losses and push as much pressure on them. So there are our top 4 tips. So with spam in general, you've just got to try and play, I guess, a delayed action as much as possible, while also going on the counteroffensive. That's probably the biggest one for me, is trying to go on the counteroffensive and use everything in your list. And this is why I always try to choose at least 1 unit in reserves. For Team Yankee, I try to do similar for Flames of War as well, just for the pure fact that it's like, it gives me more on the board. So for our West German unit, this really gives us quite a bit on the field. But yeah, going forward. But I'd say with pure tank lists going up against T55, it is a bit trickier. But then again, if you think about it, NATO has spam too. You know, you've got M60, you've got Leopard 1 spam. You know, Nordic Forces, if for any of you who've seen the preview so far, you've got Centurions. So again, you know, NATO do have some spammy tanks out there to do the same thing. So it's like, I think with going forward, you probably won't find too much spam lists anymore. Just for the pure fact that it's like, they're not the be all end all. And the other thing about spam is, if you defend long enough, you're going to get a mutual loss anyway. Because you're going to go for time. So that's another one to consider, is time. You know, your opponent, if he starts getting frustrated, he's going to start making mistakes, because he's just going to try and finish and push you off objectives in time. And if he does that gives you an opportunity to counterattack and then try to make your own push. Because if they're limited by time, they're going to take that mutual loss hit, or draw, so to speak, depending. But there's no draws, but it depends on TO. If they see one mutual loss as a draw, then they'll see it as a draw. But that's the biggest thing, is time. You've got time. He doesn't. If he wants to win the tournament, he's got to push you off those objectives in the 2 hours or 2.5 hours that's allocated by the TO for the rounds. So that's a big takeaway for me, is time. You've got enough time to push. Now, I'm not saying slow play, because slow play is really a jerk move. I'm saying play the game you are playing, but use your time wisely. And this is what I'm saying, is by using your time wisely, it's like, look conservatively, and this goes hand in hand with smeac, you know, situation, mission, execution, admin, and control. You want to try and do that every turn, and go through that process. It's like, what's your situation? You know, what's my mission? My mission is to defend and try to get those objectives. What's your execution? My execution is going to be, these units are going to focus fire on here. Okay. What's my admin? Like, what's the control methods and my admin methods? You know, how am I going to control that? How am I going to, you know, fix those issues if I need to, plug in gaps, you know? Plus also my reinforcements in regards to reserves too. So that's your smeac. And this goes hand in hand with IPB at the start that I was talking about. I will leave links to the Cove website, where all this information is available for you to have a look at IPB and smeac. This is not some government secret that ex-military members or military members have access to. This is open source. This is where anyone can have a look at. These are like where you have your colleges for your defense academies, which are open source to anyone. So don't forget, you know, people out there do university in regards to security studies, and they find all this information. It's readily available. There's nothing new to it. It's an old thing. So again, have a look at these websites, you know, especially the Cove. It's quite a good one. Go have a look. I'll put it up for you. But as we go through with T55 spam, these are the things we got to consider. You know, all these things. So let's go through our top 5 tips of taking on T55 spam. 1, IPB, terrain analysis, mission, what we want to try to achieve, and our enemies, you know, lists, and how we want to try and mitigate that. So that's part of our IPB preparation. That should be your main go-to for every single game for your in a tournament, is your IPB. Second one, yes, it's a bit of a jerk move, but enforcing line of sight, because it still needs to be enforced, but, you know, especially if it's going to be against the parking lock list similar to T55 spam. Thirdly, our third tip is your counter-offensive, trying to push, making sure you're there, getting everything, you know, your ducks in a row, trying to make sure you get there. Fourth tip is making sure that everything else is ready to go. Fifth is time. Remember, you've got time on your side, and go from there. So hopefully you've enjoyed my little spiel on taking on T55 spam. I know a lot of people will say other things in regards to this and that, but if you have any, you know, issues, I'm more than happy to answer questions, and I really do want to do a Q&A on spam lists later on, and hear your thoughts on how you would like to tackle them, or what you see as the issue with T55 spam or any spam list going forward. So I will drop those links down the bottom for those who are, you know, interested. So if you like this little spiel, please like and subscribe and support the channel, because at the end of the day, I'm hoping to get this channel to support you. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and good hunting to you all.